Today's story is about a life of a fascinating woman scientist named Nancy Wexler, who had a 50% risk of inheriting the gene for Huntington's from her mother, Lenore, who died of Huntington's disease, and Nancy's attempt to find a pre-symptomatic test for Huntington's and what happened. This is an important case not only for Nancy, but for a lot of people, because we live in the day of a lot of people are testing their DNA through companies like 23andMe, or Ancestry.com. Genomic medicine and personalized genetic testing offers a lot of promise to a lot of people. Most people test, studies have shown, to find good news or find out good things. Even adopted people sometimes fantasize that they're the offspring of a billionaire. Genetic testing also has a downside. That's kind of the moral of the story today, is to figure out whether you should really understand what you're getting in for when you test yourself. I'm Gregory Pence. I'm a bioethicist. I've been one for about 50 years, and I like to tell some stories of what I've learned. This is Great Stories in Bioethics. When Nancy was a student in college, she first learned about her mother having Huntington's. She went on to get a PhD in clinical psychologist, and she worked for most of her life as a neuropsychologist at Columbia University. Along the way, she discussed with her father, Milton, who was a psychoanalyst, and her sister, Alice, what they could do to look at their risk for developing Huntington's, which they knew because of their mother. Each daughter had a 50% risk of inheriting. The Huntington's gene and its variations are called autosomal dominant, which basically means that there's a 50% chance that each child of a parent will have the gene and pass it on. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The average life of people with the full gene is about 60, and it takes about, after onset of symptoms, it takes about 15 to 20 years for the life to end. The life always ends badly, a lot of spasms, catatonia, and a vegetative state. So it's also important to know that not much can be done about Huntington's. You can maybe ameliorate the symptoms a little bit, but there's really basically no treatment, and that's important for people tested. Humans have known about Huntington's for a long time. It existed in Scotland, Wales, and Sweden for centuries, where it was known as St. Vitus's dance. This is because Huntington's in the later stages is characterized by a chorea, where the muscles spasm in kind of very jerky, rapid ways. If you ever saw Seinfeld and Elaine trying to dance, kind of like that. It's not very fun to watch. Of importance to the research about Huntington's, in 1800, a sailor from Europe, probably from Scotland, Wales, or Sweden, jumped ship off the coast of Venezuela and had 14 children with different native women. By the year 1981, those 14 children had created 3,000 descendants, each of whom had a 50% risk for Huntington's, which is going to be important because Nancy and her father formed something called the Hereditary Disease Foundation to study Huntington's, which still exists today. We'll hear more about it later. With a researcher at Harvard named James Casella, they went to Lake Maracaibo in northern Venezuela, which had a very large concentration of Huntington's people, and got thousands of people to donate blood. And the goal then, early 1980s, was to not find the gene, but find a marker that frequently traveled with the gene. And because of Nancy's research and her help with these people, in 1987, James Casella did find a marker for Huntington's. You could give blood and you could find out whether your risk for Huntington's later was 5% or 80%. So at this point, Nancy had been working for a long time to find exactly such a marker for Huntington's. And at this point, she stunned the world by reversing herself. After spending all this time and money trying to find a marker, she decided not to take the test. And indeed, her reasoning became very important because she became a champion of not taking a test for something you really couldn't do much about. What was her reasoning? Well, when I was running the lecture series in the 90s, at UAB, I invited Nancy to come down to UAB, and she gave a talk, mostly to medical people, but everyone. Some of her reasons, especially that if you can't do anything to prevent it, and you take this test, you're going to develop what she called a sick identity. The disease and its future is going to hang over your head like a sword of Damocles. She says, the knowledge is toxic, and once it's out there, you can't get it back. So be really careful about testing yourself. She also emphasized that in testing yourself, you're testing other people. She was involved in such testing. She also helped discover the exact gene for Huntington's, which in 1993 was discovered by 6 laboratories together, which meant that you could 100% test yourself for the gene. Nancy explained, and we later learned, something very interesting about testing, and that is basically Huntington's involves erratic repeats of certain trinucleotides in genes or alleles. The number of repeats highly correlates with the severity of Huntington's and when you get it. So if you have more than 40 repeats, if you live long enough, you're definitely going to get Huntington's, going to be fully penetrated. If you have 36 to 39 repeats, it may be 65 or 75 before you first have symptoms. You may live another 10 or 15 years. If you have less than 35 repeats, you may have no symptoms at all, but your offspring may have the disease. Less than 25, and you're probably safe. In other words, it's now possible not only to test yourself for Huntington's, but to test exactly when you might first show symptoms, which is a big deal. It might be something some people want to know, but because there's no treatment, it might be something a lot of people don't want to know. In her talk, Nancy brought a video. She explained some of the problems of testing. There was one fellow who was certain he had the gene. He lived life carpe diem. He didn't have any relationships. He had a lot of debt. He tested and he found out he was clear. And his life collapsed because his whole identity is based on the fact that he was going to get Huntington. Another young woman she and her husband elected, because her mother had Huntington's, she elected to test her fetus, and her fetus was positive for Huntington's, and they aborted. The room fell silent watching this video when she said, I elected not to test myself, but only my fetus. Most people in the room knew that Huntington's does not skip a generation, that if her fetus had the condition, that the young woman whose name was Sarah would also have it. So Nancy showed this video to show that people are not always emotionally ready for bad news, and each person is different. A genetics counselor has to work with them, not only for them to have theoretical knowledge, but gut knowledge of what it might feel like to get bad news. And a lot of people aren't really ready to hear bad news. Another thing about genetic testing is that some people are very suggestible. I'm very suggestible. If you told me I had an increased risk for prostate cancer, I might start worrying about every little symptom and seeing myself as a prostate cancer victim long before I had any symptoms. One of the difficulties in genetic counseling here is to know the relative risk. If you told me I had a 50% greater than normal risk of having prostate cancer, I might be worried. But if the normal risk is 1 in a million and my new risk is only 2 in a million, that's no big deal. But if the normal risk is 1 in 3 and now my risk is 2 in 3, that is a big deal. So it's important to know the context when you get genetic information. Nancy stressed that you shouldn't test about good genetic counseling, and that good genetic counseling is, number one, hard to find, it's expensive. Most insurance plans don't cover it. So have to be really careful testing. Some of the online spit tests where you test yourself for your genes, she was not very comfortable with that because she thought the counseling information was very sketchy. Sometimes she said the information is toxic. Art Kaplan, the bioethicist, once told the story of a man whose wife had breast cancer, the breast cancer gene, and he tested his young daughter, who also had the gene right before puberty. Because the daughter was positive for the breast cancer gene, he wanted her to have a double mastectomy. This is way too young, and for Nancy, it would destroy the girl's life, and it's not too early to tell her something like that, but once you do, you can't get it back. Another really interesting part of genetic testing is what's called a non-paternity event. When I first was teaching in the medical school, I once went to a genetics lecture. I guess this was about 1980. I heard the professor say that about 2% of people who test themselves find out that one of their parents is not their real biological parent. Well, since then, we've had sperm donation, egg donation, fraud, infertility clinics, all kinds of things. And the incidence of a non-paternity event, or NPE, is probably more like 4% now. In fact, there are so many non-paternity events. There's now a podcast, I think it's called NPEs or NPE fellows. There's a Facebook group, and it's estimated that about 2 million Americans have misattributed parentage. So if you're not ready for this, don't test yourself. It's also true that you might test for, say, the breast cancer gene, but consent to a whole hotel of tests. And you might be relieved that you don't have the breast cancer gene, but find out that you have a gene for polycystic kidney disease. Now that might be good. It might alter the way you live, but it might also just give you a feeling of being a victim long before you actually have any symptoms. Again, Nancy was a passionate advocate for not testing, especially for Huntington's. She once told the audience, "What are you going to do? Wait your whole life for your first symptoms?" She said, "Don't do that. Get a life, go to law school, move on," which is exactly what she did. Not everybody agrees with Nancy. My late friend John Fletcher, who was a bioethicist from Birmingham, spent most of his life at UVA, Virginia. He complained to me once that he thought people had been Wexlerized against genetic testing. They should all go out and test themselves. Nancy retorted to me once that she didn't like this attitude. She found it kind of macho, like you got to take your genetic test and be a man and take it like a man, no matter what it is. She thought this was not a great attitude. And maybe because of Nancy, the 100,000 Americans who are at risk for Huntington's, very few of them have actually tested themselves. Something interesting happened at Nancy's talk, which was in Spain Auditorium at UAB near our medical hospital. Nancy and I were lingering at the lectern, and a frail homeless woman about age 62 approached us and told us that she had recently been diagnosed with Huntington's, abandoned by her family. Unfortunately, something that happens where families feel overwhelmed by the long-term care of such a person, and it really is a very heavy burden. And Nancy was very compassionate towards this woman. She was too young for Medicare, went to the neurology department, tried to help her get care and help her somehow get payment for her care. Nancy went on to have a very distinguished career at the Hereditary Disease Foundation. She was an inspiration for many young women scientists. There's a very nice video on YouTube from the Hereditary Disease Foundation about the effect of Nancy on women scientists. She won the Lasker Award for research in science. In 2008, she helped get a drug called tetrabenazine approved, which had been approved in 2000 in Europe. So it was approved in 2008 by the FDA in America, which reduced some of the chorea of Huntington's victims. In 2020, at age 74, Nancy publicly revealed what had been obvious to many people around her, that she had in fact inherited the gene for Huntington's. There were some test strips for her at the time. Shortly thereafter, she disappeared from public view. Her family, her sister, are probably caring for her. She did reveal at the time that she regretted, in retrospect, not having children, that she probably was overly cautious that way. As far as I know, in September of 2025, her body is still alive. She had a profound effect on many people, and certainly we learned a lot about testing from her. That's it for today. If you like this story, give me a thumbs up, or subscribe, or hit the bell. Thanks a lot.